The Dutch shipped over 500,000 African slave-made people across the Atlantic Ocean. Responsible for this transatlantic slave trade was the Dutch West India Company. It made a fortune for the Dutch Republic. In this video, you're gonna learn how the Dutch West India Company made the golden age for the Dutch Republic and the history of the slave trade. Until the end of the 16th century, Dutch merchants sailed across the seas. They went to Northeast America, to the Caribbean, and to West Africa as well. In West Africa, gold and ivory were retrieved, fur came from North America, and salt from the Caribbean. In 1629, these companies were united in the Dutch West India Company. In Dutch, wait for it, de Geollocteerde West-Indische Compagnie. You say that 5 times in a row. You can do it. The main force behind the Dutch West India Company, in short the WIC, was the Antwerp merchant Willem Usselincx. WIC was governed by the Heren 19. In English, it's the Lords 19, which had also a representative of the States General who governed the Dutch Republic. The States General gave the WIC a monopoly on the triangular trade between Africa, America, and Europe. This basically paved the way for the transatlantic slave trade. So how did the slave trade work? Okay, Dutch ships sailed from the cities of Amsterdam and Vlissingen towards the African west coast. These ships were packed with European industrial goods, think of luxury products and guns, and they sailed to fortresses on the West African coast. The most famous, or I should say infamous fortress, was the fortress of Elmina, which is located in present-day Ghana. There, the Dutch were handed over slaves, or actually I should say slave-made people, because these people weren't slave by origin. These men, women and children were robbed of their freedom while they were living in the African interior by fellow Africans. They were chained up and brought to the African west coast, and there these local African tribesmen handed them over to the Europeans in exchange for these luxury products. Now, in the Netherlands there is a debate whether you should call these people slaves or slave-made people. Now, I understand these Africans weren't born as slaves, and the whole crime of slavery is better accentuated when you say slave-made people. However, you and I, we know that the slave trade and slavery was one of the biggest crimes in human history, and for the sake of convenience, I stick to the word slaves. These slaves were put on European ships, and these ships sailed for the Americas. Now, in favorable weather conditions, the journey could take 3 weeks, but in worst case, it could take 4 months. This picture right here shows the horrifying conditions the slaves had to deal with. It is true that the Europeans wanted to keep the slaves alive, because a dead slave isn't worth anything. Yet in reality, mistreatment and sexual abuse were common phenomenon, not to mention the outbreak of diseases like smallpox and dysentery. Here you see a list of the Dutch ships that sailed from Africa to the Americans in the 17th and 18th century, and gives you an impression of what the death rate is. One interesting example I do like to mention out is that I read in a Dutch school book about the disaster journey of the Dutch ship Eva Susanna. This ship arrived in Paramaribo, what is now Suriname, in the year of 1726, with only 31 slaves alive of those 217 that went aboard in Africa. However, I did some further research, and the people who wrote the school book, they did make a mistake, because not 31 slaves were alive, no, 31 slaves died on the journey and 186 arrived alive. Now, this is not meant to downplay the seriousness of the situation. It was horrifying, but it's just interesting, something I like to point out. Most slaves were shipped off to Paramaribo and others to Curacao. When arriving, they had a week of rest. Now, not out of humanitarian reasons, no, the slaves had to recover in order to look good, because a weak looking slave doesn't ensure high biddings. Then the slaves were sold. Now, after the WIC had contracts with plantation owners, and a certain amount of slaves went to the plantations directly, and there they had to work. Now, the life of a slave beyond this point deserves an episode of its own, but it's beyond the scope of this episode. When the WIC was founded in 1621, the 12 years truce between the Dutch Republic and Spain had come to an end. The Dutch were fighting a war of independence against Spain since the year of 1568. What started as a rebellion led by Dutch nobleman William of Orange escalated into a full-scale war of independence that dragged on for many decades to come. In 1609, 12 years truce, a temporary ceasefire between the Dutch Republic and Spain commenced. Spain could now recover because it was exhausted by the many wars it was fighting, but also the Dutch Republic could now recover and focus on trade. Then, in 1621, the 12 years truce ended, and the Dutch Republic and Spain were at war again. With Spain as an enemy again, the Dutch Republic saw privateering, piracy as you will, as a legitimate act of war. The WIC was set up in the plan of Groot Design, Grand Design, in order to rob Spain of its colonial wealth. Spain was robbed of its potential to wage an effective war against the Dutch Republic, was the idea. Most piracy was perpetrated at the Caribbean. There were economic and geographical reasons for this. It was that most of the Spanish and Portuguese, the Dutch were also in war with, plantations were located near the coastlines. So piracy was all about hit and run. So this proved to be very effective. However, the greatest wealth of the Spanish and the Portuguese was at the silver mines in the Mexican and Peruvian interior. However, these were not attacked by the WIC, and this is quite logical, because in order to capture these silver mines, they had to set up large and costly military expeditions to seize control of these mines that were located so far away from the coastlines. However, saying that the Dutch didn't attack the silver mines does not mean they weren't able to capture the silver. The most famous privateer was Piet Hein. In 1628, he captured the Spanish silver fleet with 31 warships. He took 17 Spanish galleons full of gold and silver. This was a major achievement for the Dutch Republic, and there's even a song about this guy. Piet Hein, Piet Hein, Piet Hein, zijn naam is klein, zijn dat. Let's continue. This act of piracy delivered the Dutch Republic $10 million, which is today's equivalent of 100 million euros. With this, WIC was able to finance its extension of its fleet in order to attack Portuguese colonies. This brings us to the colonies. The WIC ran several colonies. Early 17th century, the Dutch captured the northeastern part of the American continent and named it New Netherlands. When the WIC was established, it took over control of these Dutch overseas possessions. Up until this point, New Netherlands consisted of small settlements that traded with the local Indian population. In 1664, before the outbreak of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, an English fleet arrived at the colony of New Netherlands, and realizing that resistance was futile, the colony of New Netherlands, with New Amsterdam as its capital, was handed over to the British. Now, after the war was over, the British kept in control of New Netherlands. The Dutch, on their turn, had their influence in Dutch Guyana, which later became Suriname. Suriname is located in the north of the South American continent. It was the place where most of the Dutch slaves were shipped off to and had to work on plantations. Suriname would remain a Dutch colony till 1975. Then there were also the Dutch Caribbean or the Dutch Antilles. Some of these islands are still under influence of the Netherlands. As of now, Curaçao, Aruba and Sint Maarten have the status of special township. Bonaire, Sint Eustatius and Saba are autonomous within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Back to the 17th century. Okay, in 1629, the Dutch agreed that Portuguese Brazil had to be taken. The northern part of Brazil could be used as a base for attacking Spanish ships and also plantations. The Dutch offensive was initially successful. However, at some point the Dutch offensive was halted, and also the Portuguese kept harassing the Dutch troops by guerrilla attacks. In 1636, Prince Johan Maurits became the Governor-General of Dutch Brazil, and he wanted to extend the Dutch influence, so he continued the military campaign against the Portuguese. The Dutch were successful in the north, but were halted in the south by the Portuguese. Also, the plantations that had proven to be very lucrative weren't lucrative at all, because they were either destroyed by the war violence or the personnel that manned the plantations were chased away because of the war. In 1641, the Dutch and the Portuguese agreed to a ceasefire. In 1655, when the Dutch were waging war with England, the Portuguese managed to retake their former colony, and so Dutch Brazil came to an end. The loss of Brazil, as Dutch historian Henk den Heijer puts it, was because of the ideal picture the Dutch had that the whole of Brazil had to be taken. But in reality, it proved utterly inefficient. Like mentioned before, the sugar plantations weren't lucrative because of the war, and the war itself costed enormous amounts of money. Instead of just agreeing with the Portuguese to divide the colony. In this case, you can clearly state that the winner does not take all. Now, historian Henk den Heijer goes even further than that, because he claims that because of the loss of Brazil, the WIC went bankrupt eventually. Because of the major debt, it could have made further investments in, for example, the trade in West Africa, which had its potential. Because of its existing trade and overseas possessions, a second WIC was established, which held out for another century. However, it was a demise from the get-go, and in 1792 the Dutch state took over its possessions, just like it did after the VOC went bankrupt. If you want to know more about the VOC, I actually made 2 videos about that. One of them I shot on location in Indonesia. You can check out right here. Now do check me out on Patreon for cool perks when supporting me. Check me out on Instagram and Facebook. Do not forget to subscribe, give this video a like. See you later.